She was just another elderly woman flying coach until a flight attendant struck her across the face mid-flight. But 5 minutes later, the entire crew found out who she really was, and everything changed. What happened next didn't just shake the cabin, it flipped the airline upside down. It was 10:45 p.m. when Flight 4811 from Denver to San Francisco began boarding its final passengers. The lights in the cabin had already dimmed to that soft, golden hue airlines used to signal bedtime, and the gentle murmur of voices, rustling seatbelts, and the occasional ding of the overhead bin gave the atmosphere a kind of quiet anticipation. It was late. People were tired. Most were settling in for the short, 2-hour hop to California. In seat 12D, Claudine Rivers gently eased herself back into the thin blue cushioning of the economy-class chair. She moved with deliberate grace, like a woman who had long since earned the right to take her time. At 69, Claudine's hair was a halo of soft silver curls pinned neatly behind her ears. Her cardigan was buttoned high, her slacks pressed, and her expression, the kind only age and decades of restraint could shape, was calm and unreadable. She carried with her no air of superiority, no attitude of entitlement, only a sense of quiet self-possession. It was the kind of dignity people often confuse for fragility. She had just reached down to adjust her seatbelt strap when it started. "Ma'am," came a sharp voice from the aisle. "Seatbelt needs to be fastened now. We're about to taxi." The voice belonged to Tracy Blanchard, a 31-year-old flight attendant with tight features and a tension in her shoulders that looked like it had built up over more than just this shift. Tracy had been on duty since 6 a.m., and the day had been long. Delays. Demanding passengers. 2 screaming toddlers in row 9. She was running on fumes, caffeine, and the brittle willpower that comes just before collapse. Claudine looked up, not startled but gentle, and nodded once. "Yes, of course. Just about to." But Tracy didn't wait. She stepped closer. "Now, please." Her tone was clipped, her posture aggressive, as if compliance was a race against time. Claudine's hands moved toward the buckle, the motion slow but steady. That's when it happened. A smack. Sharp, loud, undeniable. Gasps broke across the rows like dominoes. Someone dropped their earbuds. A man 2 seats back said, "What the hell?" Claudine had been mid-motion, reaching for the metal tongue of the seatbelt, when Tracy's hand connected with her left cheek. Open palm. No warning. No apology. Just a hard, sudden strike. The slap echoed, not just in sound but in sensation. It pulled every eye within 20 feet toward row 12. Tracy stood rigid, flushed in the face, breathing heavy, her hands slightly trembling. Claudine's head turned slightly from the impact. Her cheek colored in slow motion. She didn't cry out. Didn't flinch. She simply raised one hand, touched her cheek, and turned back to look up at Tracy. "You shouldn't have done that," she said. Her voice was quiet, like the hush before thunder. No anger. No panic. Just a calm so steady it made the moment more unsettling. That's when the cabin changed. The man across the aisle from her leaned into the aisle, staring. A woman behind her pulled out her phone. A teenager in 14B mouthed, "Did she just?" to her mom. Everyone knew what they saw. The silence of a late-night cabin had been shattered. Tracy's eyes darted across the faces. Her breathing became shallow. She was refusing to fasten her seatbelt, she said quickly, defensively. "I gave instructions." Repeatedly. Claudine blinked once. "You didn't give me time," she replied softly. "You spoke, and then you struck me." There was no malice in her tone. If anything, there was more compassion than anyone expected. That only made the tension worse. A young male attendant, his name tag read Marcus Lane, came hurrying up from the front. "What's going on?" he asked, looking between Tracy and Claudine, then at the stunned passengers around them. Tracy looked like she was about to say something, defend herself, maybe double down, but Claudine raised one hand, not in protest, but with polite clarity. Could you please inform the captain, she said to Marcus, that Claudine Rivers would like a word before we depart? Marcus paused. His brows furrowed. Sorry, did you say Claudine Rivers? Claudine opened the side pocket of her purse and pulled out a slim leather wallet. From it, she retrieved an ID card, simple, professional, edged in silver. She handed it to him. Marcus looked at it once, then again, and his face lost its color. Yes, ma'am, he said. Right away. Tracy looked confused. Wait, who is she asked. Marcus didn't answer. He just walked quickly toward the cockpit. Tracy, meanwhile, snatched the ID from Claudine's hand before she could tuck it away. Her eyes scanned the text. Her breath caught. President and CEO, Crescent Air. Her mouth dropped slightly. No sound came out. Claudine held out her hand. Tracy placed the card back in her palm without a word. That's when it sank in. This wasn't just a passenger. This was the Claudine Rivers. The woman who transformed Crescent Air from a struggling regional carrier into one of the fastest-growing airlines in North America. The woman whose photo graced business magazines, but who rarely appeared in public. No interviews. No grandstanding. Just results. And tonight, she'd been slapped by one of her own employees while flying incognito in coach. She hadn't arrived in a power suit. She hadn't demanded champagne or attention. She had simply taken her seat and followed protocol. Until the woman tasked with protecting passenger safety became the very reason it was jeopardized. Now Tracy stood, frozen, caught between shame and disbelief. Passengers stared. Some shook their heads. Others whispered. And Claudine sat there, still and composed, her cheek red but her poise unshaken. She didn't need to say it. Everyone in that cabin understood now, the rules had changed. The slap may have been physical, but the silence that followed, it spoke louder. The air inside Flight 4811 hadn't quite settled after what had just happened. Moments ago, the cabin had been wrapped in the sleepy quiet of a late-night departure. Now, it buzzed with unease. The slap still echoed, not in sound, but in the stunned expressions of the passengers, and the stiff movements of Tracy Blanchard as she backed away from row 12, and in the way the silence seemed to lean in on everyone. Claudine Rivers sat motionless in 12D, her posture upright, hands resting gently on her lap, her left cheek faintly red where the blow had landed. She didn't blink. She didn't look around. She didn't reach for her phone or raise her voice. She simply waited. The kind of waiting that held more power than protest ever could. Marcus Lane had already disappeared to the cockpit after realizing who exactly was seated mid-cabin in an ordinary coach seat. He knew the name. Everyone in the industry did. Claudine Rivers wasn't just a name on a business card. She was the architect of the airline they all worked for. Crescent Air had been a mid-tier regional carrier until she took the helm. Since then, it had become a national brand, one built not on PR flash, but on logistics, structure, and silent excellence. And now, the woman who led from behind the scenes had been slapped in full view of a dozen passengers. The captain, a seasoned man named Daniel Bryce, stepped out moments later, composed and professional. He leaned toward Claudine and offered her a quiet, respectful greeting. Ms. Rivers, would you prefer to speak here or up front? She tilted her head slightly, the smallest smile forming. Let's keep things efficient. I'll come to you. She rose, unhurried, the cabin following her movement like a ripple on still water. As she walked up the aisle toward the cockpit, all eyes followed. No one said a word. Not a cough, not a rustle. She didn't need an entourage. Her presence alone commanded attention. In the galley, Tracy stood frozen, her arms crossed tight against her chest, her breath shallow. She had heard the name now, Claudine Rivers. It rolled around her mind like a weight she couldn't shake. That can't be the CEO, she had whispered to herself. But the ID card said otherwise. And Marcus's reaction said more than words ever could. She hadn't just struck a passenger. She had assaulted the woman whose decisions shaped the paycheck she'd been depositing every 2 weeks. For the first time that day, Tracy's voice had left her. She leaned against the cold wall of the rear galley and closed her eyes. Her legs trembled. It wasn't just the fear of losing her job. It was something else, something deeper. Shame. She hadn't seen Claudine. She had seen what she assumed was a slow-moving, difficult passenger delaying her already long shift. The kind she had quietly resented on hard nights like this one. But Claudine hadn't been rude. Hadn't ignored her. She had simply been moving at her own pace, and in a flash of pressure, stress, and exhaustion, Tracy had crossed the line. And now, there was no taking it back. As Claudine disappeared through the cockpit curtain, a passenger in row 11 discreetly pulled out their phone. The screen lit up. The tweet was already going viral. Something wild just happened on Crescent Flight 4811. Flight attendant slapped an older woman and now she's apparently the CEO? It wasn't even 10 minutes before the replies started flooding in. No way. That can't be real. Please tell me there's video. Someone had already posted a blurry, low-light clip. Just the sound, barely audible, but the gasp, the hush, the voice that followed, "You shouldn't have done that." It was enough. Enough for corporate in LA to get pinged. Enough for Slack messages to start flying between departments. Enough for the HR crisis line to ring. At 38,000 feet, Crescent Air was flying directly into a corporate firestorm. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Claudine didn't raise her voice. She didn't ask for retribution. She didn't demand anyone be fired. "This flight will proceed as scheduled," she told Captain Bryce. "But Tracy Blanchard will not speak to me for the remainder of it. Please make that clear. I'd like written accounts from the crew and a preliminary incident report filed before we land. That's all." The captain nodded solemnly. He didn't ask why she wasn't pressing further. He understood. This wasn't about revenge. This was about clarity, order, accountability. And Claudine, as always, was in control. Back in the galley, Tracy had sunk to the jump seat, eyes glassy, fingers trembling around a paper cup of water. Eli, another crew member, stood quietly nearby. "She's the CEO," he said, not unkindly. "I know," Tracy whispered. "No," Eli said more firmly. "She's the CEO." Tracy looked down at her hands. Her voice cracked. "I didn't mean to. She was looking at me like she didn't need me. Like I wasn't important. Like I didn't matter." Eli didn't respond right away. He knew what that feeling was. The burn of invisibility. The sting of being overlooked. But what Tracy didn't seem to grasp yet was that Claudine's silence hadn't come from indifference. It had come from experience. She'd been through worse. And she had chosen dignity not because she had to, but because it was the only thing that ever worked. "You don't get to hit people because you're tired," Eli said softly. "You don't get to do that, Tracy." She swallowed hard. "Am I getting fired?" "That's not up to me," he replied. "But I think how you handle this next part matters more than what already happened." In seat 12D, Claudine had returned. She didn't make eye contact with Tracy. Didn't speak to the crew. She simply resumed her position, adjusted her cardigan, and opened the paperback novel she had tucked into her handbag. The cabin, still thick with tension, gradually resumed a semblance of normalcy. But no one forgot. The passengers didn't go back to dozing. They watched. They whispered. And the air never quite lightened. Claudine's thoughts drifted, not to lawsuits, not to headlines, but to her grandson, Caleb. 14 years old, growing fast, already learning how to walk in a world that didn't always see him fully. Already learning to keep his hood down in public. Already asking questions about how to stay safe. She thought of her own mother, who used to be followed around department stores just in case. She thought of the long meetings she'd sat through where her opinions were repeated louder by someone else in a suit. She thought about every woman who'd ever been told to stop making it about race when it had been about race from the start. Claudine hadn't gotten where she was by demanding attention. She got there by watching, by listening, and by acting only when the moment called for it. This was one of those moments. From seat 12D, she wasn't just riding as a passenger. She was leading, quietly, completely. Somewhere over Nevada, another tweet went viral. She didn't even raise her voice. Just told the pilot she wanted to speak. And when I tell you the whole plane froze when we saw her ID, the responses kept coming. Screenshots. Threads. DMs. The public didn't know all the details yet, but they didn't need to. They had seen enough to understand that something profound had occurred at 38,000 feet. Not a meltdown. Not a dramatic confrontation. Just a woman, seated with dignity, shifting the ground beneath her without ever raising her voice. Tracy sat in the galley long after that. Still in uniform. Still clutching her cup of water. The sting of what she'd done, what it revealed about her, settled in. And she knew, deep down, no matter what happened next, this flight would follow her for the rest of her life. Because sometimes the people we overlook the most are the ones who write the policies we live by. And sometimes the loudest response is no response at all, just quiet strength in a seat labeled 12D. At 1:58 a.m., the wheels of Crescent Flight 4811 kissed the tarmac of San Francisco International Airport, the jolt rippling through the cabin like a silent exhale. For most red-eye passengers, it would have been a routine ending to a long flight. But for everyone on board this particular journey, nothing felt routine anymore. The slap that had cracked the silence hours earlier still lingered in the air, unspoken but unforgettable. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, no one reached for their overhead bins. The usual end-of-flight stirrings were replaced by something taut and watchful. Seatbelt signs were still lit, but every passenger sat up a little straighter, every glance bounced between row 12 and the front galley. They all knew something was coming, and that it wouldn't be a quiet goodbye. Claudine Rivers remained composed in seat 12D, her hands folded gently across her lap, paperback novel closed neatly on the tray in front of her. She had not spoken a word since her brief conversation with the pilot hours ago. She had not demanded anything more than silence from the woman who had struck her, and yet her presence had reshaped the entire dynamic of the flight. Now, as the plane rolled to a stop at gate C12, two silhouettes became visible through the small windows at the front of the cabin. Standing just beyond the glass of the jet bridge were two individuals not in TSA uniforms, not airline ground crew, but tailored, poised, and clearly waiting with purpose. One was a woman in a sleek gray blazer with a Crescent Air Operations badge clipped to her hip, Linda Garrison, Senior Director of HR. Beside her stood Jared Torres, Regional VP of In-Flight Services for the West Coast Division. Both had been pulled from bed hours earlier when the viral posts first hit their alerts. Both had reviewed the flight manifest in real time and seen the name, Claudine Rivers. And now, as the cabin lights brightened and the final chime sounded, they stood ready, not for a formal press briefing, but for something more delicate. Claudine stood last. As expected. She allowed every other passenger to gather their belongings and file into the aisle. Many turned to glance at her one last time. Some nodded silently. Others simply looked away, unsure what to say but aware they had witnessed something remarkable. She didn't acknowledge the glances. She just stood, smoothed her sweater, lifted her small carry-on, and walked forward with the same quiet grace she'd maintained since boarding. Tracy Blanchard was nowhere in sight. She had remained hidden in the back galley since the incident, eyes red, throat raw, mind spiraling through every possible consequence. Claudine didn't ask for her. Didn't need to. As she stepped into the jet bridge, Linda Garrison extended her hand. "Ms. Rivers," she began. But Claudine raised a hand of her own, gently, firmly. "This doesn't need to be handled in the dark," she said. "If your instinct is to pull me into a private room so no one sees this, don't. There's nothing discreet about accountability." Linda faltered for half a beat, then nodded. "Understood." Jared swallowed and stepped forward. "We've grounded Ms. Blanchard and begun a formal internal investigation," he said. "She won't work another flight until a full review is completed." Claudine gave a single nod. "Good. And I expect written witness statements from the entire crew, along with a full report delivered to my office before noon." "Of course," Jared said. "Will you be filing a formal grievance?" She looked at him. "No," she said. "I'm not seeking punishment. I'm seeking progress. If Crescent Air is going to claim it leads with integrity, then this moment, this flight, needs to mean something." Linda shifted. "Would you like to speak to the press?" Claudine shook her head. "I already have." Within hours of her arrival at her San Francisco office later that morning, the company's inboxes were overflowing. The video, blurry but undeniable, was circulating on nearly every major platform. Media outlets were requesting interviews. Hashtags were trending. And the most repeated question, echoing across comment threads and headlines alike, was stark: if she hadn't been the CEO, would anyone have cared? Claudine released a public statement by 2 p.m. It wasn't ghostwritten or polished by legal counsel. It was her voice, plain and direct. "I did not speak out to defend my position. I spoke out because I could. Because so many others in my place, black women, elderly passengers, everyday travelers, don't get the same opportunity to be heard, let alone believed. I don't want vengeance. I want responsibility. I want systems that stop asking us to shrink so others can feel big." The response was immediate. Powerful. Polarizing. Some praised her restraint. Others accused her of playing the power card. But one thing was undeniable: the conversation had begun. Tracy Blanchard, who had remained silent through the early storm, submitted a written statement to HR 5 days later. And with Claudine's permission, it was published to the company's employee bulletin in full. "What I did was wrong. There's no excuse. I was exhausted, yes. Under pressure, yes. But that doesn't justify what I did. I didn't see Ms. Rivers for who she was, and not because of her title, but because of my own bias. I assumed, I reacted, and I failed. I've accepted Crescent's offer to remain under probation, to complete comprehensive training, and to meet with mentors, because I don't want to walk away from this unchanged. I want to grow. And I am deeply, profoundly sorry." Claudine read the statement in her office, her glasses low on her nose. When she finished, she folded the paper once, placed it inside her drawer, and said only one word to her assistant: "Implement." That same week, Crescent Air launched a new initiative, Cabin Code, a mandatory ethics and empathy training program co-designed by HR professionals, diversity advocates, and frequent flyers. It would be the first airline program of its kind to require both staff and passengers to complete a digital pledge of conduct. Not just for legal reasons. Not for PR. But because dignity, Claudine insisted, was a shared responsibility. Internally, the board voted to support the initiative unanimously. Publicly, the company pledged a new standard, one built on listening, not reacting. On seeing people, not dismissing them. Claudine declined every interview request that came her way. She didn't appear on TV. Didn't issue sound bites. She didn't need to. The work was already in motion. And those who had witnessed the moment, who had sat in rows 11 and 13, who had whispered after the slap, who had recorded video or comforted seatmates, carried the story for her. Because sometimes, justice doesn't thunder in like a storm. Sometimes it walks down a narrow aisle in a soft cardigan, takes a seat in coach, and shows the world what power looks like when it's quiet, unwavering, and unshaken. Claudine never once raised her voice. And yet, everyone heard her. Thank you for joining us for this powerful and deeply moving story. As the author, I want to take a moment to reflect on what Claudine Rivers' experience aboard Flight 4811 truly teaches us, not just about justice, but about leadership, dignity, and the strength of silence. In a world that often rewards the loudest voice in the room, Claudine reminded us that real authority doesn't always need a spotlight. Sometimes, leadership looks like sitting quietly in seat 12D, never raising your voice, never demanding attention, but commanding respect through calm composure, wisdom, and unwavering conviction. One of the biggest lessons in this story is about the importance of not judging others based on appearance, age, or position. Tracy didn't see Claudine for who she was, not because Claudine hid her power, but because Tracy assumed she had none. That assumption cost her more than just embarrassment. It revealed how dangerous unchecked bias can be, especially in positions of authority. For every Claudine out there, quiet, dignified, underestimated, I hope you know that your presence holds power. You don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need to retaliate to stand firm. When you carry yourself with integrity, the world eventually takes notice. You might not always be able to change people's minds in the moment, but you can shape the moment itself and leave an impact that lasts long after you've walked away. For those of us who are watching, who are learning, we must ask ourselves, how often have we dismissed someone based on a split-second impression? How often have we assumed ignorance where there was wisdom, weakness where there was quiet strength? Let this story be a reminder that every person we encounter carries a story we may not yet understand, and a value we don't get to measure with our own expectations. To the flight attendants, the teachers, the public servants, and everyday workers, your role is more than service, it is stewardship. You don't just represent a company. You represent humanity. The way you treat people in moments of stress speaks volumes about the world you're helping to shape. And to those who've ever been silenced, overlooked, or underestimated, remember Claudine. She didn't retaliate. She didn't seek revenge. She stood still, and in doing so, the whole system shifted. On behalf of U.S. Justice Story, thank you for listening, for reflecting, and for standing with us in these moments that matter. If this story inspired you, please share it. Let it be a spark of change. And as always, treat others with dignity, speak truth with courage, and never forget, sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest lessons. We'll see you in the next story.